We're going to mention some special scenarios, common things that are done in error, a little bit about microphthalmia and nanophthalmia, because they're specific cases that I think are important for people to know about, and then what to do if someone has laser refractive surgery, how do you calculate their lens, and what do you do if you get an unexpected outcome. So here's an example of someone with high axial myopia, and this is a very long eye. And you can see this is a B scan, but here's the A scan underneath. And so if you see a very long eye on the A scan reading, it's a good idea to do a B scan to see what's happening at the back of the eye. And an example of why this is important is in this case. Here you can see a large posterior staphyloma. And this patient was interesting because she needed a -20 implant. Now this was about 15 or 20 years ago, and they didn't make -20 or even -15 implants. They made -10 was the lowest they made. So we had a long discussion about where we were going to try and leave her when she got a cataract. We did the surgery. I said she was going to come out probably -8 or something, and her glasses would be a bit lighter, but she'd be happy. And she came out 6.6 unaided, emmetropic. And I said, well, of course I did that on purpose. But actually what had happened was I'd measured her staphyloma by mistake, and it was an accident. It was a fortuitous accident. So really important, if you get a very long eye, check the A scan, check the B scan, look for a staphyloma, and have a fixation target so you can get them on their fovea, because that's the bit you want to measure. My technician who does these measurements insists on using this as her fixation target. I have offered her a picture of me, but she seems to think this chap's better looking for some reason. Here's an example of a choroidal neoplasm, and although the A scan is not showing here, you'd get a much earlier retinal peak. So again, if you're getting a reading that you don't understand and doesn't really fit with what's going on, always do a B scan and you'll find some surprises. Here's an example of that. So again, an early retinal peak. Why is that? On the B scan, there's a retinal detachment. So again, in a dense cataract, you'll have to use A scan. If you get an early retinal peak, what's happening? Here's another example. This is again, an early retinal peak, not so early as the previous one, but there's a disciform hemorrhage, again, behind a white cataract. So the A scan should guide you as to, if there are other things going wrong, you should be looking with B scan to try and determine what's happening. Another example we mentioned earlier, silicon oil, a low velocity of sound through silicon oil, so the sound travels more slowly. The transducer thinks it's a much longer eye because it's taken longer to get there and back. And you get an artificial hypermetropic result. So these patients always come out +5 if you don't take that into account. So reset the velocity setting, the gates on the machine before you do this measurement. We talked about that. So microphthalmia and nanophthalmia are very special cases, and it's really important if you see these eyes that they're treated with utmost care, because quite often what you see is a patient who comes into clinic with a glass eye on one side because someone tried to do their cataract 20 years ago and it all went horribly wrong, and now they've got very poor vision in their only eye, and they've waited and waited and waited to have it done because of what happened in the other eye, and it turns out they've got microphthalmia or nanophthalmia, and they're very, very difficult eyes to deal with. So the definition, any eye with a corneal diameter less than 9 millimeters or more than 2 standard deviations from the normal axial length. And if you see that, you should anticipate major problems. They have a very thick sclera. You can probably see on the scan here, if I can go backwards, a very thick scleral reading, and that's universal. They get choroidal detachments and effusions. They get suprachoroidal hemorrhages very easily, very shallow anterior chambers, and they may need a vitrectomy to decompress the eye, but the problem is the pars plana anatomy is very different, and it's very easy to detach their retina by putting instruments into the back of the eye. So they are very complex. But the point of showing these eyes is that when you do the biometry, it often comes up that they need a lens of about 60 diopters. Now, they don't make lenses of 60, or a few companies do, they're made to measure, but they're rare. So what a lot of people do is they end up putting a piggyback lens in. They put a 40 and a 20. And that's not a good thing to do. It's much better to use a single lens in these eyes because they are so shallow. And what it turns out is that if you do the standard biometry and you find they need a 60 diopter lens, put in the highest one that you've got, something like a 40 usually, and then just correct the residual hypermetropia with a contact lens or glasses. Because quite often what happens with these eyes is they come out very undercorrected in terms of what you have predicted. So instead of being 60, they actually come out at 45. And then you're only dealing with 5 diopters of hypermetropy, which is much easier. So that's what I suggest you do with them. Just put in the maximum power lens that you have and correct the residual with contact lenses or glasses. And always give these to a senior surgeon. They're very prone to iritis, choroidal effusions, aqueous misdirection, and you need to see them the next day after the surgery. Here's an example of one of these eyes post-operatively. This eye actually had to have a decompression with a vitrectomy, and a couple of years later the cornea is decompensating. They're very difficult eyes to deal with. But in terms of optics, go for the highest plus you have and treat the rest with a contact lens. So moving on briefly to laser refractive surgery, I always ask the patient specifically, has anybody lasered your eyes? Because I have said to people, have you ever had surgery on your eyes before? And they say, no. And you do the operation, they come out +3, and then they say, oh yeah, I had laser, but that's not surgery, is it? So it's really important to put that word laser into their mind. And it might be 20 years ago they had this. I was involved with some of the early PRK trials in the early 90s, and those patients are now coming through with their cataracts, and they've forgotten they've had surgery, some of them. So really important to ask. Get as much information as possible, and indeed, if you're going to do laser to somebody, make sure you give them a piece of paper with their pre-op Ks on it, and all the measurements they might need when they have their cataract done later. It's good medicine. There are papers out there in the JRCRS in 2015. This chap, Savini, used 4 different methods for assessing different groups of patients with different amounts of information. And actually, by using the appropriate information, you can still get good outcomes. So it's worth reading that paper. But nowadays, it's much easier just to go online and use the ASCRS online calculator. And usually, this is what happens. If you had previous myopic LASIK, you come out +3, and if you had previous hyperopic LASIK, you come out +2 as a guide. Sorry, -2. So if you see a patient in your clinic who's +3 unexpectedly, that's probably the reason. And here's the online calculator. If you go onto the ASCRS site, you can access this free of charge, and you simply click on one of those prior myopic LASIK, prior hyperopic LASIK, or prior RK, and it takes you to the next screen. You just fill in all the details that you've got. You won't have all of this, but they ask for everything. Fill in as much as you can, and then it goes away and does a calculation for you. I didn't put any numbers in that, so it's come out blank. But what it gives you at the end is the average IOL power from all the formulae that it's used here, and the minimum and the maximum. And that gives you a very good spread of lenses that you can then choose from. So that's becoming quite accurate. We now get quite good outcomes using that formula in our prior hyperopic or myopic LASIK patients. Dealing with unexpected outcomes, what do you say to the patient if they come back to the clinic and you're expecting 6/6 from your beautiful surgery and they're actually +3 and they can't see anything? And communication is the critical thing. So in the UK, we have a thing called the duty of candor. We are required by law to tell the patient what's happened and why. We can't hide behind anything. Obviously, be honest, it's really important. But the important thing that I found helps most is to say, look, you've got this problem, I apologize. Apology is not an admission of guilt or fault. It's just empathy, and we heard a bit about that earlier. Let them know there is a solution, and you will do your best to make sure that they get as good an outcome as they can. They may need another operation. So always recheck the biometry, make sure that the readings are or were good. And then there's no harm in suggesting glasses and contact lenses. They work. They're easy, they're non-surgical. Some patients say, oh yeah, that's fine, I don't mind wearing glasses, that's absolutely fine. Others say, no, I want good distance vision without them, and for them, you can give them an IOL exchange for the correct lens, and if you do that, just make sure that you have different options on the shelf, so that one that goes in the sulcus, one that goes in the bag. In case you damage the bag, you need a sulcus option. So that's if the source of the error is known. If you find that the biometry was all over the place and you've repeated it and you've now got accurate biometry, you can offer them a lens exchange. But if you're not sure where the error is, if the biometry looks like it was good, then if you just repeat the biometry and do more calculations, you're going to get the same error. This is one of those systematic errors that you don't know where it lies. So again, consider glasses and contact lenses, but in those patients it's probably better to offer them a piggyback lens which goes in the sulcus because the equation for that is based on the refraction, and that you can do very accurately. So once you've refracted them, there's an online calculator again. So here, for example, is the the ray trace program from Rayner's. If you go onto their website, you can actually log in and you can access these calculations for sulcoflex lenses based on your refraction. And so it's a really accurate way of correcting these people post-operatively, which works well. So attention to detail on the biometric printout is really important. You've got to know what the squiggly lines mean. You've got to know what the numbers mean. You've got to actually look at it before you put a lens in, make sure you're happy that the K readings are as you think they should be. Might it alter where you sit? You know, should you do a temporal versus a 12 o'clock incision if they've got more astigmatas in one direction? Really important to look at those numbers and be able to explain the differences. But modern formulae do allow you to choose the closest to zero than you can, and make sure you discuss the refractive aim with the patient, because they're the ones really at the end of the day that need to be happy with the outcome. Thank you very much.